So you know from talking about skeletal muscle that anytime we have a specific neurotransmitter, we also have to have a specific receptor. So on this slide, we're looking at two different types of acetylcholine receptors. One type is known as a nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, and it gets its name because it's also activated by nicotine in addition to acetylcholine. Nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are ionotropic receptors, and that means that they're essentially ligand-gated ion channels. They're ion channels that have an acetylcholine receptor attached to their extracellular domain. Now, you kind of know this already, even though we're using some more specific terminology, because we've talked about acetylcholine receptors earlier in the course back in our skeletal muscle unit. Remember that we have acetylcholine receptors on the motor end plate, and those acetylcholine receptors there are examples of nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. That's because when acetylcholine binds, we have a cation channel that opens, and that allows the sodium ions to flow into the muscle cell. These nicotinic acetylcholine receptors are also found within the autonomic nervous system. Now remember that all preganglionic neurons are cholinergic in both divisions. So that means that all of the postganglionic neurons have to have acetylcholine receptors on their dendrites, because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to receive the message that the preganglionic cells were sending them. So we find the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors on the dendrites of all of the postganglionic cells in both divisions. This should make a little bit of sense because remember that the function of a neuron is to start an action potential. And in order to start the action potential, you would need to have synaptic potential. When you have these nicotinic acetylcholine receptors that open, it allows ions to move across the membrane on the dendrites, which means we can produce EPSPs in those postganglionic neurons, and they can use those EPSPs to bring their channels to threshold and start the action potential so that that message can get relayed a little bit closer to the target tissue. Now, the other type of acetylcholine receptor is known as a muscarinic acetylcholine receptor. And this is an example of a metabotropic receptor, or a receptor that's not an ion channel, but is more associated with signaling enzymes that are inside of the cell. Now, we haven't really talked a whole lot yet about signal cascades and signaling enzymes, but it is going to be one of the major focuses of the next unit. So right now, I'm just going to mention that these muscarinic receptors can activate or inhibit signaling enzymes inside of the tissues that have them. Muscarinic acetylcholine receptors are specific to the parasympathetic nervous system. We find muscarinic receptors on target tissues that are innervated by postganglionic parasympathetic nervous systems. Muscarinic receptors are only in the parasympathetic nervous system and only on the target tissues. That should make sense because remember, in the parasympathetic division, all of the postganglionic neurons are cholinergic. That means they all release acetylcholine. So if a target tissue is going to respond to the parasympathetic nervous system, it needs to have an acetylcholine receptor. And it has the muscarinic variety, the metabotropic kind. Now, in the sympathetic division, remember, we have postganglionic adrenergic neurons, and those don't release acetylcholine, they release norepinephrine. So the target tissues that are going to be receiving signals from the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system have to have adrenergic receptors. They have to have receptors that are activated by epinephrine or by norepinephrine. So adrenergic receptors are also metabotropic receptors. They can activate or inhibit signaling enzymes inside the target tissues. There are different types of adrenergic receptors. So they can be alpha 1, alpha 2, or beta 1, or beta 2, or beta 3 adrenergic receptors. And we're going to tease out a lot of those differences between different types of adrenergic receptors in our next unit, and more so in the next half of the course. But the major point that I want to mention right now is that this is one of the reasons why we can have such diversity of responses during the fight or flight response. So I have different types of adrenergic receptors that are located in different places inside the body, but all of them respond to the exact same neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So when I want to have a smooth muscle cell contract, I can use the alpha variety of the adrenergic receptor. But in a place where I want smooth muscle to relax instead, I can use the beta variety of the adrenergic receptor. So every single target tissue that responds to sympathetic nervous system is going to have one of these different types of adrenergic receptors. So like I said, we'll be taking a closer look at the adrenergic system as an example in our next unit so that we can see what some of these responses actually look like inside of target tissues. So the reason why the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system can produce opposite responses is because they use different neurotransmitters that can activate different types of receptors. The parasympathetic division would activate the muscarinic receptors on the heart, and the sympathetic division would activate the adrenergic receptors on the heart. And each of those drives a different physiological response. So the reason why the sympathetic nervous system can sometimes activate opposite responses on the same tissue type, like for example, smooth muscle, is that some regions of the body have smooth muscle that expresses alpha adrenergic receptors, and that produces a contraction, whereas smooth muscle in other places inside the body has beta adrenergic receptors, and that produces relaxation instead. So receptors determine the response. Receptors determine the response. That's going to be a major point for our next unit. And this is really the first example of that we're seeing in this course. So let me wrap up this denser part of the unit by showing you a schematic diagram of the organization of the autonomic nervous system. You definitely want to be able to tell me which neurons are cholinergic and which ones are adrenergic. And you also want to be able to locate the specific types of receptors and neurotransmitters that I've mentioned as well. And so a diagram like this one is a really good way to practice doing that. But we're actually going to make this diagram even better when we're together in class. We'll be drawing a schematic of the ANS and actually summarizing a lot of what I've talked about in this entire unit.